So welcome everyone to Queer River, Wetland, the sharing event. My name is Cassie Dyllan and I'm the Cultural Activities Coordinator at the College of Arts at the University of Glasgow. And I'm really, really pleased to be here just to introduce this event and also to introduce you very briefly to the Dear Green Bothy project, which is sort of the umbrella programme really, which through which Queer River Wetland, I should say, has developed. The Dear Green Bothy it's been a programme that's been running since the summer, I think I'm right in saying, since June. It's been a programme hosted by the College of Arts, which has been particularly interested in creating a hospitable place for hosting conversations, exchanges about the role of the arts in relation to sustainability, in relation to climate emergency. Partly inspired by COP, but really to do with beginning conversations that are going to be taking place for much, much longer than the duration of COP. COP has been and gone, but we are still here having these conversations. I'll put a little link in the chat box later on, just so you can see more about what that programme has done and ways for you to get involved. But Queer River Wetland has really been one of those projects, one of those collaborations that has run its course all the way through the programme since the summer, really. And so it's really lovely, after all the sort of frenetic energy of COP, to come to maybe some slightly calmer waters and to begin properly reflecting on what has been achieved through the project, what we've learned through the collaboration, and very importantly, what comes next. So it's very much an informal, interactive event. There'll be a chance for you to ask questions and to take part in the conversation at the end, following a series of presentations. So do bring your own practice and your own perspectives to bear as well. I'm just looking at my notes here to see if I need to do any sort of the boring housekeeping, but I think what I'll do in the meantime is I'd really love for our main speakers just to sort of introduce themselves very briefly before they give their sort of more formal presentations later on. So maybe what I'll do is hand over to you, James, very quickly, just so you can introduce yourselves and we'll go through and I'll come back and run through the running order.
Lovely, thanks, Kazi. So my name's James Aldridge. I'm based in Wiltshire. I'm an artist working with people and places, and I set up Queer River about a year ago. So I'm here to share all the work that's happened to set the context of Queer River and more specifically Queer River Wetland.
Excellent, thanks, James. Minty, you're next on my screen, so let's jump over to you.
Hello, hi, my name is Minty Donald, and I'm an artist and also a professor of contemporary performance practice at the University of Glasgow. And I work a lot with water. I work with my regular collaborator, Nick Miller, on water. And James invited me to be a collaborator on this project. So I've been kind of involved in the Glasgow part of Queer River from its outset, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Minty. And let's jump over to Sage. Am I right, Sage, you're in Durham?
That's right, yeah. I'm an artist geographer at Durham University. And I'm interested in queer and trans ecologies and in the, I guess, kind of politics of nature in wetlands. And I used to live and work in Bristol and was supposed to go for a walk with James as part of this project along the Bristol Avon, but have ended up in Durham. So today I'll be talking about my experience with working with the school, but in the Dearness Valley in County Durham.
Thank you, Sage. And Malú, over to you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Malú Cayetano. I'm a landscape architect and based in Madrid. I'm talking to you from Madrid, and well, I will be telling you a bit about my practice and also the particular situation in Madrid with creeks and hidden and forgotten creeks.
Great to have you. And I'm imagining that your room might not be as dark as ours in Glasgow.
It's also getting dark here.
Okay. And last but not least, over to Rachel.
Hi, thanks, Cassie. So I'm Rachel Clive, and I am a theatre practitioner and a researcher, and I've been working with Rivers for about 5 years when I was doing my PhD, which I've just finished at Glasgow Uni, which was to do with how neurodivergent people, how we connect with rivers and how we make work with rivers and how we understand rivers and our relationships with rivers. So James invited me to collaborate with an event, a Queer River event in September, I think it was, James. And it was just such a joy. It was just absolutely brilliant, but we'll talk about that later. But yeah, really, really delighted to be here.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone. I'm really looking forward to learning more about your practice and your work. So just to run very quickly through the order of events today. So we're going to hand over to James first. So just to tell you a wee bit more about Queer River and how that led on to the collaboration Queer River Wetland. And then it'll be a series of short presentations from our presenters here, based on their own practice and their own relation to this work. Minty in particular will talk about the performance score that has been devised as part of this project, but she'll be able to elaborate more. So the presentations will take us up until about 10 past 6, depending how strict we are on time. And then we'll open up to questions. So please, during these presentations, please do feel free to put anything in the chat box. We'll come back to them at the end. We'll try to allow about 20 minutes at the end of the session for a more open conversation. But I think, unless there's anything that I've forgotten, I will disappear and hand over to James to kick things off.
Lovely. Thank you, Kazi. Right. Okay, can we see that okay?
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so it's brilliant to see you all here, first of all. I'm very excited to have everyone together, bringing all the different threads of Queer River Wetland together today. And what I wanted to do was to, if you like, set the context in terms of what Queer River is, and then focus in on what happened during Queer River Wetland, which will then lead on to Minty talking about the performance score and people's responses, which will come afterwards. So here's a couple of images from the work in Glasgow. So back in September, as Rachel said, I went to Glasgow and I spent a couple of days walking with some lovely local people. On the first day, I walked with Minty and we walked along the Rivers Kelvin and Clyde. And the whole point of Queer River is that it is about walking and talking and making with rivers, both human and non-human community that make up a river. So we're looking at a river in its broadest sense, rather than, if you like, a ribbon of water that stretches across the land. It's considering what is or what can be a river and what do they need from us in the future. So on the first day, it was myself and Minty generously leading me through the city, really following the path of the rivers and just paying attention to what we could see around us, but also talking about Minty's practice in terms of her work and its relationship to rivers as well. On the second day, we then met up with Rachel, who you've met, but also with Ingrid Shearer, who's an archaeologist and works in heritage engagement and is doing some work around the restoration of a boathouse along the river. And also Cecilia Tortajada, who works with corporations and governments and so on around essentially resource management, as I understand it. So it was about having all these different perspectives on rivers and walking and talking and creating a space for dialogue as we went. So as I said, walking along the Kelvin, down to the Clyde, and our path taking us past one of the main sites for COP, which was then a construction site, essentially. And I've personally found it fascinating to be walking along past the site where all these talks are going to happen, and part of our conversation was around what voices are included within these talks. What voices are generally included in discussions around climate, the climate and ecological crisis. For instance, arts versus science, queer voices or not queer voices, disabled voices or not, and so on. And while we were walking, because there was such a range of perspectives on the rivers, we were talking about the heritage of the river. We're talking about the future of the river in terms of flooding and so on, and the impact of extreme weather events. It's very much a multi-layered and interwoven dialogue as we went. And I offered people a chance to document their walk in different ways. So if people were happy to walk and talk and take the odd photograph, that was fine. But I also supplied some simple resources. So some little files that people could collect things in if they wanted to, some paper, some pens to make marks and so on. And the whole reason that the Queer River Wetland came about was essentially through Minty and I talking about our practices and looking at the sort of shared ground, if you like, in terms of us exploring the interrelationship of water and land. And the whole point that essentially you can't find the point at which a river starts and ends. It isn't just, as we say, like a blue stripe across a map. It isn't that simple. It's integrated with the city effectively, and therefore our ways of living with and seeing rivers need to reflect that. And so effectively our walk was an attempt to gather in these different voices together and to consider what might the Clyde and the Kelvin need from us in the future, which again seemed very appropriate in light of COP and the COP construction site being on the banks of the Clyde. So you could basically turn one way to see the Clyde or turn round to see the site. But in terms of how that fits into Queer River as a wider project, I set up the Queer River Research Project pretty much a year ago now. People ask me what it is, and it's quite hard to describe what it is because it's a sort of emergent process, but there are certain key things that I follow through it in terms of methodology and subject matter and the themes that I'm exploring. So essentially, in terms of methodology, it is me walking and talking and making with other people with their local rivers. It's about considering how diverse experiences of and perspectives on rivers intersect and allowing those to sit together and seeing what we can discover from that, including those of people within the LGBTQI+ community. It's about the impact of the climate and ecological crisis on river ecosystems and other wetlands. And as a knock-on effect of that, looking at climate justice as well. So queer people's experiences of climate justice, but also starting to look at disabled people's experiences as well. How the coming extreme weather events and flooding and so on impact unequally on different groups within our community. But also looking to the future, if you like, some of the more positive stuff in terms of regeneration and restoration and rewilding. And I'm quite interested in the relationship between rewilding and queering in terms of looking at, if you like, unstraightening rivers in terms of blurring the boundaries and the binaries that exist between humans and nature, between land and water. And yeah, how that relates to, again, what rivers need from us in the future. So how that's actually looked is either been me approaching people and saying, I really like your practice, do you fancy going on a walk together? Or it's people getting in touch with me and commissioning me or inviting me to be part of some work that they're working on. So I've just included a few people here to give you a bit of a flavour of the breadth of expertise and insight that's been brought to the project. So we have Minty in the middle, and Minty's making some marks there with some chalk that I brought along from my own local valley, because one of those connecting points that I talked about that in terms of our shared practices, if you like, was that Minty was doing some work around using the silt from the Clyde, and I was doing some work using some chalk from the Avon Valley near where I live. And I brought some of that up to Glasgow for us to playfully do whatever we fancy doing with it, essentially. But what we started to do was to mark the edge of the river, and we soon noticed how quickly the tide was coming in by how quickly those marks were submerged. So top left, that's Tim Sykes, and he is doing some research at the University of Southampton into people's emotional relationship with winterbournes and chalk streams. So by winterbournes, I mean rivers that quite often rise up in the winter and go away in the summer. So there's streams perhaps that only exist in people's consciousness or awareness during that time when they're actually visibly flowing. Catherine, who I see is here in the audience, top right, Catherine Lamont Robinson, who's an artist and a researcher in the medical humanities. One of the key threads that we were looking at is blue health, in terms of what impact does being in or by rivers have on people's health and well-being. Bottom left is Mark Spencer, who's a botanist, and we were taking a walk by the Thames estuary, considering amongst other things what happens when as the sea level rises and there's increased salination in rivers and increasing temperatures in cities. How does that impact on the flora, essentially? And Mark also has a background in AIDS activism as well, and we were looking at the relationship between climate activism and AIDS activism. So I'm just giving you a little taste of what has been a very rich interwoven year, essentially. Bottom right is Peter Reason, who's a retired academic now, who much of his career was focusing on action research, and now he's doing a lot of writing and research to do with rivers and river sentience, and thinking about our orientation towards rivers. How do rivers respond when we approach them with an assumption of that they have sentience and awareness? So these are just a few of the people that I've walked with over the year, really, to give you a sense of the fact that it's very much about learning from each other. It's very much about dialogue. It's not about having a preconceived idea of what I hope to gain from the walk, but more an openness to what might emerge. And I know I've only got a couple of minutes, so just to say, where does all this go? Essentially, I process my learning through writing and through making. And so all of these walks are written up on the blog, on the Queer River blog, which I can put the link in the chat to. So this is a taste of the writing after Minty and mine first walk. And then I use drawing and making, as I said, to process as well. So for instance, there's drawings here that I've made using ink, and I've made the ink from the cones on an alder tree that grows at the river near where I live. Or I had a bit of a medical emergency earlier last year when I found out I had kidney stones, and then I went off on a complete tangent exploring what happens to the, if you like, the water in the rivers within the body and outside the body. And the patron saint of kidney stones happened to be someone who's closely associated with rivers and that kind of thing. So you can see that my research, if you like, flows like a river flows, and very much is responsive to the people that I work with and walk with. And then that may well turn into an exhibition, a presentation, a workshop, or a piece of writing, depending on whether I'm the one that's setting up that piece of work or whether I'm being invited to do so. But in terms of Queer River Wetland, I was invited to bring Queer River to Glasgow, and through meeting Minty and beginning our collaboration together, Queer River Wetland was born, essentially. So that's probably a good point at which to hand over to Minty and for her to share a little bit about what happened next, if that's okay. So I'll just stop sharing.
Okay, so is that over to me?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, James. That was really great. I'm going to use some notes because otherwise I do tend to ramble on and go over time. So excuse me if I'm reading a few bits of what I'm saying. I'm going to talk quite a bit about performance scores, really. We used performance score became a sort of one of the outcomes of our walking and talking and thinking and making together. But it's also something that I use a lot in my practice, which I work in regular collaboration with another artist called Nick Miller, who I believe is in the Zoom room somewhere as well. So as I said, I'll share my screen now. Okay, so as I said, one of the outcomes of our walking was the creation of a performance score that we co-authored, which could act as an invitation to other people to participate in the project with other rivers and in other places. This is a score we wrote, and I know some people have submitted responses to this score, and some other people are going to be talking about it, sharing their responses with you after I've finished speaking. But I'm going to say a little bit about the idea of performance scores and how Nick and I use performance scores and why we use them. So I'll use us, we, and ours quite often. And when I'm doing that, unless I say otherwise, I'm referring to Nick and me. I'm not trying to speak on behalf of humanity or being the royal we or anything like that. So performance scores are at the heart of our ongoing project with rivers and other water bodies, which we call Guddling About. I don't know if anybody here knows the word guddling. I think one person in the audience at least does. Does anybody know what the word, actually I've just put the definition up. Do people know the word guddling at all? You can put something in the chat box if you like. So the word guddle, it's a Scots language word, and it means to mess about or to act in a playful and undirected way. So when I was young, you know, my mum would say to me, stop guddling about if I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing. But it's got a secondary meaning, which means to catch fish by hand, groping under rocks or riverbanks where the fish hide. And as a noun, it means to be a mess, a tangle, or in a confusion. So this word seemed to us quite appropriate for our kind of exploratory practice. And this is the front page from our website for Guddling About. So Guddling About is an evolving suite of actions or micro performances with rivers and other water bodies, and each action is described as a score or a set of instructions. This is the first score that we devised for a micro performance called Water Carry. And the scores and micro performances are intended to prompt the reader or the enactor to do a number of things. First, they're an invitation to people to become more attuned to the presence of water in their immediate environment, to pay close attention to how it moves, where it comes from and where it goes, how it is controlled and managed. The performance scores are also offered as an encouragement to attend to our sensory, poetic and imaginative interrelations with water. They're a prompt to pay attention to the specific material and cultural conditions of each watery environment, while recognizing that we humans and all other life forms are also interconnected through our dependency on water. So as Aspira Neimanis puts it, we're all part of a radically embodied hydrocommons, but also that we must listen to the differentiated needs of the multitude of bodies within it. So this kind of sense of being sharing a connection with water, but also paying attention to difference. So we have made generic versions of the scores, which are also adapted in response to different contexts. The scores aim to acknowledge what is common or shared in our human interrelations with water, and also what is specific to each context. This is the generic version of the Water Carry score. And it's been adapted in various contexts and various places. In Madrid, working with Malú, who's going to be speaking shortly, we changed it to carrying water from a fountain. That's it's an English translation. We also made postcards, which we were able to kind of distribute the scores to different people to be able to do, and here in Spanish, in Castilian Spanish. So yeah, so this kind of idea that they can be taken and used in different contexts. We see these scripts then as a kind of open source material, and that we intend them to be taken, used and adapted by anyone and anywhere. Malú has quite recently been using some of these scripts adapted to her own context, and also one of them, Transporte de Agua, is, sorry, terrible pronunciation there, is Spanish for water carry. But Malú's also invented some new scores, kind of using the same ideas, but extending that. So Escucha de Agua, and listening to water. For Nick and I, another important aspect of what the scores do is to highlight some of the tensions that exist in human-water interrelations. And what I mean by this is the ways in which humans attempt to use, control, and manage water, and the ways in which the force and vitality of the water evades that control and management. So in the Guddling About micro-performances, we aim to acknowledge the agency and vitality of water bodies and to consider them as our collaborators, while also recognizing that the collaboration does not take place on equal terms. We try to challenge human attachment to systems that regulate water while facing up to our implications in this form of human exceptionalism, the belief that water is a resource for human use, that it can be constrained and managed. So for example, in the water carry action, the water does have agency in that it determines the end of the performance when the water runs out of the carrier's hands. And we also in water carry like to think about the water writing its own scores in these trails of drips that you can see in the ground here. So it's a kind of authorship of agency in this way. We've also tried to write the scores in an alternative way from the point of view of the water, rather from that of the human enactor. So this version here tries to turn it around rather than thinking about the action from a human perspective, to kind of write it from the point of view of the water, with all the contradictions that are entailed in that as well. But all the while, we're aware that in this and in the other Guddling micro-performances, the water's agency is constrained by our intentions. While the water does have some agency, it is we humans who initiate the actions and frame them as micro-performances. The way we use performance scores has an affinity with the event scores that were a significant feature of the work of the Fluxus artists. I'm sure many people here will be familiar with the Fluxus artists. There's one score by Ken Friedman. Fluxus, as I said, I'm sure many of you know, was a loose grouping of artists most active around the 1960s and 1970s. One of the things that drew us to the Fluxus event scores is the ambiguity in some of the scores about who or what might undertake the action. So this event score by George Brecht, the protagonist is clearly not human here and is water in various forms. Our performance scores, like the Fluxus event scores, are prompts towards some kind of action. It's usually an action that seems simple, is often pointless or absurd, at least from a rational Western perspective, and it can be very difficult or even impossible for humans to achieve. So a couple of Fluxus scores that have impossible or difficult to achieve. Is that impossible? I don't know. And again, another score, removal, which feasible, but very difficult. This score for an action in Madrid, while not impossible, is certainly ambitious and unlikely to be realized. To translate the Spanish, it says, make a hole in the ground of the Calero Park in a place where you think that at one time the Calero River flowed. Dig until you find water. So the park and the Parque Calero is in a place where there was once a river or stream called the Calero. And in the course of urban development, it has been buried and covered over, as is the case in many cities. And I think Malú is going to be talking about that later. So the name is the only reminder of the river here. Like the Fluxus scores, while some Guddling actions are intended to be physically enacted and are relatively easy to enact, others are much less so. Like the Fluxus scores, our performance scores are also prompts to the imagination. We feel there's a potency in imagining some of the more impractical or impossible actions, such as this one. Again, another one from Madrid. So I'll let you read that. So again, not impossible, but with them quite a difficult to achieve action, but one that I think is resonant if we imagine it. So I wanted to just end by showing my response to the Queer River Wetland script that James and I wrote. It's a very hasty response. I want to develop this further, but I'll just end by showing this. And I walked along the River Clyde in Glasgow and also the Rio Manzanares in Madrid. And both of these rivers are hard-edged rivers. There's a very clear delineation between the water and the land, but the responses of the city, they're very different in character, and yeah, they're just very different rivers, but they're also the responses to kind of how that harsh binary has been dealt with are different. But I'll just play this now to finish off. That's it, that's the end. Thank you. I hope I didn't go on too long there.
Thanks, Minty. So it's we hand over to you, Rachel, please.
Yeah, no bother at all. Thanks, James.
Lovely.
And thank you, Minty, as well. Two really brilliant presentations to follow from. I'm going to try and share my screen as well. See if I can get that up. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so as yeah, first of all, I'm going to do a wee bit of reading from my script as well, because otherwise I will ramble and go on and on and on. So forgive me for reading a wee bit as well. I think we'll probably have some more dynamic presentations coming later, hopefully. But I want to say, first of all, a thank you so much to James for inviting me to take part in this fabulous Queer Rivers project, and for inviting me to share some of my work around rivers as part of his project. So you've been incredibly generous, James, and it's been a real pleasure to engage with you. And also with the Wetland project, and I'll kind of talk a bit more how it also intersects with my work, and also it's always such a delight to work with Minty as well, because I think river geeks, we seem to find each other out. And there's just something about rivers. The more you start working with them, I think the more they start ruling the show, really. And it's just so lovely as well, seeing all the river pictures and on the screen that I'm sure we're all sharing. So as I said before, I'm a theatre practitioner, a writer, and an interdisciplinary researcher, and I've spent the last 5 years exploring how humans, especially neurodivergent humans, connect and might evolve performatively in connection with rivers and estuaries. I'll talk a wee bit about that work before sharing how it intersects with James's work and how we kind of explore some of those intersections. So the PhD, the work that I've been doing has been a part of, I completed that earlier this year, and that PhD was working across these disciplines of theatre studies, disability studies, cultural geography, and geomorphology. And it evolved through 5 performance projects with around 50 participating neurodivergent performers from across central Scotland. It also included an autoethnographic project in which I explored performatively my own neurodivergence and my own living relationships with rivers. And work from all of these performance projects, from all 5 of them, is ongoing. Because as James said, river work it finds its own flow, and things just keep going and coming back and taking their own way. So my PhD proposes a new model of performance practice called the Performic Cycle. And this is a model that's based upon the ecological concept of panarchy. And panarchy is a non-hierarchical and adaptive systems thinking approach, which was created by ecologists Gunderson and Holling. And it argues that the innovation that we will need to adapt to climate change comes from working across the social, the ecological, and the economic spheres through the adaptive cycle and through processes of transition across adaptive cycles and across space and time. The adaptive cycle is the basic life cycle of all life forms and processes, and it can be crudely represented as the ever-repeating cyclical movement from growth to conservation to release to reorganization. And the Performic Cycle model of performance practice that I propose in my research takes the basic premise of panarchy, but argues that we also need to engage with the expressive, the aesthetic, and the performative as we attempt to change our systems and behaviours in order to adapt to the very real effects of climate change. The Performic Cycle, as I propose it, was developed in collaboration with diverse groups of neurodivergent, mostly autistic and or learning disabled performers, artists, horticulturalists, and thinkers. It proposes a way of working performatively that takes account of the full life cycle and of the often contradictory dynamics at play between humans and our living environments. It suggests that we move beyond the growth and conservation stages of the life cycle that most capitalist systems are stuck in and learn to embrace release and reorganization as well. It argues that finding ways of working safely with release will be essential if we are going to have a chance to reorganize collectively and ensure our own and each other's survival. So the Performic Cycle model supports people to connect, research, and perform with the natural landscape forms and processes that we live with, whether in urban or rural contexts. It creates a space in which we can explore the ways that we relate to each other and to the earth, in which we can rehearse new ways of understanding our interlinked movements, materialities, responses, and responsibilities to ourselves, to each other, and to the environment. Performic cycle methods include what I call body worlding, vital materialist storying, autotopography, and geomythology. These methods work across art forms, embracing film, sound, and poetry, as well as performance, story, and movement. The performances that emerge through working with the Performic Cycle model aim to disseminate the findings and artworks created in these explorations in ways that are led by the performers or participating artists themselves. They seek to initiate new kinds of dialogue across traditional boundaries and divides as a result. So loads of questions have emerged through this research. And as I said, loads of these questions are ongoing, and I'm continuing to explore them in various different projects with various different people. And some of them are really, really relevant to James's Queer River project and completely resonate with James's work. So one of these questions that's emerged through this research that resonates most strongly with James's work, from my point of view, concerns the demonization and stigmatization of flooding rivers, and how this can relate to the demonization of queer, especially in my case, neuroqueer humans. And to explore these questions, I turned early on in my research to freedom space for rivers thinking, which is the idea that rivers need the freedom to burst their banks when they're overwhelmed, and that doing this not only helps rivers to deal with varying water levels and climatic conditions, it also nurtures the land and promotes biodiversity, creating rich habitats for multiple species and life forms. When natural flood fields are built on by property developers, for example, the river loses its freedom to spill over and naturally re-find itself when it's overwhelmed. And this can lead to far worse flooding, especially in terms of impact on human life and human infrastructure, than would occur if rivers had their original, naturally defined freedom space. So my ongoing research is interested in the proposition that humans, and in particular neurodivergent humans, also need freedom space to spill over when overwhelmed. My argument is that not having safe spaces to do this causes great problems for many neurodivergent people, essentially creating disability. The spilling over or release itself is not the problem. It's often a natural physiological response that has evolved in order to regulate the human's neurological system in its own way. Safe and dedicated freedom space to stim, to melt down, to shut down, to have a seizure, or to respond to overwhelming stimuli is a necessity, not a luxury, and is certainly not something to be prevented, demonized, or punished. And it can, when accepted and supported, lead to new ways, new understandings, enrichment of culture, and a genuine appreciation and acceptance of diversity. So neuroqueer ways, I argue, can subvert dominant anthropocentric and ableist understandings of our connections with our environment and promote new ways of understanding and new ways of performing with rivers and with others. So the link with James's Queer River project is obvious, as also is the link with James and Minty's wetland focus, given that freedom space for rivers thinking is all about the relationship between the river and the earth. And it's been joyful to engage with these aspects of both James and Minty's research, and to chat with James about some of this thinking as well. So related to this idea of freedom space in my research has been the idea of flow, which I've explored with particular reference to ideas of autistic flow. And autistic flow is a state of deep, pre-conscious thought and active engagement with the environment that many autistic people can access when freedom space is a given. And I'm interested in how valuing this experience of flow might subvert capitalist ideas of the necessity for never-ending growth and exploitation. Accessing flow states and learning to release, as well as to accumulate, build, and consume, is as necessary to the life cycle and continued evolution and survival of life forms as growth and new life. So this is the basic premise of the Performic Cycle that my research proposes. The more environmental and social end of the Performic Cycle research focuses on intervening in two particular discourses: flood risk management discourses and autism research discourses. So at the end of one project, which had engaged with around 20 trainee horticulturalists and neurodivergent horticulturalists in the River Forth catchment area, two collaborators and myself contributed to a national flood risk management conference. And at this conference, we urged flood risk managers and policymakers to engage in more accessible and creative flood risk management consultation practices. So this kind of goes back to what James was saying at the beginning about who's included in these conversations and why and how. And we were also encouraging people to listen more attentively to local knowledge and to promote the capacity of people labelled as learning disabled to lead flood risk management consultation practices, and to start community-based conversations about flooding and rivers. So we shared our strategies for community empowerment through creative art science practices, and part of our argument was that marginalised, stigmatised, or traditionally disempowered communities are often the most negatively affected by the impacts of climate change. However, we were also arguing that such communities have much to teach those who tend to assume dominance in ecological and political discourses, not least in terms of practices of resistance, solidarity, and interdependence, all things that will be crucial for humans as we adapt to a rapidly changing climate. So following the final project of my PhD, two collaborators and myself also contributed to an international autism research conference in which we discussed how we had been exploring our understandings of our neurodivergences through questions of freedom, space, and flow, and through engaging performatively and materially with the rivers that we live by and that we're connected to energetically. And at the moment, I'm exploring some of these ideas in a project called For Freedom Space with Rivers, a project I'm delivering also as part of the Being Human Festival with a long-term visual artist collaborator of mine called Kirsty Stansfield. One of Kirsty's roles in her life is as a visual art facilitator in a hospice in Glasgow. And she's got her own evolved practice, which is interested in exploring questions of autonomy through arts practices with people approaching the end of their lives. So we're just at the beginning of this project, which is starting as COP26 ends, and it's focusing on human relationships with the energies and materials of the River Clyde, and as the title suggests, on freedom space with rivers, and on working towards that freedom space in a variety of ways. We just had our first workshop in Glasgow University just a couple of weeks ago as part of the Dear Green Bothy programme, and our next project will be at the Prince and Princess of Wales Hospice in early December. The project will culminate in a performance event or sharing, the exact nature of which will be collectively decided by everyone engaging with the project. And it would be lovely and gorgeous if anyone wants to engage with that. And I will maybe put a wee link onto that later if I get a chance. But I'd like to end, this is just an image from that first workshop where we were playing with what happens when the water is released with ink, and when we let the water find its own way across the page, and then also play with how the words then also interact with that process. But I'd like to end by reading a poem that I wrote. Have I got time to do this, James, or am I going on? Yeah, nice one, thank you. And I wrote this poem after engaging first with James's walk that he mentioned in September. It was such a delight for me to be facilitated in my river connection by someone else instead of facilitating other people's river connections, and it was just such a treat. And I was surprised that what came from that was actually a poem rather than anything else, rather than a performance or a movement score or anything like that. So I won't repeat where the walk went, because I think both James and Minty have already mentioned where that was, but it was down the Kelvin towards the confluence with the Clyde. And the poem includes actually some of the thinking I've shared with you today, but with specific reference to the River Kelvin, which is my closest river. It's the river I live closest to. It's literally just at the end of my street. And the poem documents my reflections on the Queer River Walk that we shared. And James has very, very sweetly shared this poem on his blog, which it was very sweet. And the poem is called Familiar and Strange, A Queer River Walk with James Aldridge, Minty Donald, Ingrid Shearer and Cecilia Tortallada. Glasgow, 10th of September, 2021. 5 queer river lovers, familiar and strange, meet on the dividing line of blue and green. Consider the edges. On the grey bridge under their feet, a small brown slug squidges past a sycamore wing, a plastic cup lid, and an orange train ticket. Under the slug runs the Kelvin. A student runs from one side of the bridge to the other, takes pictures and disappears. An elderly man picks up litter, quietly attending to his city. Dogs lead their humans to water and trees. A sleepy bee loses its bearings. Buses rumble and birds cry out, beware, beware. The queer ones follow Kelvin. Fluid, non-binary interminglings, blonde sandstone standing by windswept red. The blonde sandstone is older. Rats feast in cars while humans sleep, but the rat race is for rats, and we are at the confluence where Kelvin meets Clyde. Govan keeps watch. 2 white swans shake their feet and wiggle their chests, protecting their large grey young. Feathers roll and tumble up the slipway, trembling with the wind. The tide is out and the surface is slippery. I pick up a toy car and a broken lighter, luminescent leftovers like squid remains in plastic bins. Materials break down. Release can be unpredictable. I wonder who the car belonged to, whose hands have played with it, how it ended up here, how I end up here time after time with Kelvin and Clyde and the turning tide. The trucks thunder in to clean the hard, grey riverside. The noise of their engines is shattering, like gunfire exploding. The birds scream and I cover my ears. There's nowhere to hide. We need to reorganize. thank you. I hope I didn't go over time, James.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to whiz on quite quickly just because I just want to point out to people that the performance score is online. I've put the link in the chat, and we'd very much welcome any more responses to that. If you follow the link, it will take you to a blog post where you can download the score, but also, sorry, I'm just sharing my screen as I talk. Also, it will have an email address where you can either email it to us or you can use the hashtag on social media in order to share it. And what I've started to do is to gather those responses together on the blog. I'm not going to spend a long time showing you these because I'd rather give time to the presenters that we've got today. Sorry, that's the wrong one. But I am just going to show you the page. Here we go. Right, so can you see this page okay?
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. So on the page we have, as it says, Queer River Wetland Performance Score responses. We've had several films that have been submitted to us, obviously of people either actually physically engaging with their local river or of their reflections on the process when that's happened before. So some purely text. This one from Carolyn Black at the River Severn, which I can play you a little snippet of in a moment. This is the one that's purely text that I was saying about. This is from Jerry O'Brien and the Birdie House Burn. Susan Merrick in Hampshire, who was responding to the score whilst engaging with the mud at the edges of the Blackwater River. And then Helen Clark and Sharon Witt, who worked together as Attention to Place, who've made this piece called Becoming Lost with Meon. So I'm going to put the link to this page into the chat so that you can go and in your own time watch these films rather than me take up too much time and eat into Malú and Sage's time. But as I say, if anyone else would like to respond to Minty and my score that we've put together in whatever way you want to, please do, and then you can share the documentation with us and I can share that on the Queer Rivers site. Okay, I won't actually share any of the films right now just because I'm looking at time and I think it'll be better to move on to Malú. So let me just stop sharing that one. Malú, can we hand over to you, please?
Yes, thank you very much. Once again, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be among such great practitioners. As I said before, I'm a landscape architect. I work in Madrid. I've been working or collaborating quite a lot with artists, with Minty and Nick. She explained a bit about it before. So I'm gonna give a brief overview of Madrid context in terms of all these hidden streams and forgotten creeks. In the last year, since I think 2018, more or less, I've been doing some informal research somehow of how this the relationship between the city of Madrid and water has been changing. I curated an exhibition recently here in the city of Madrid about this changing relationship of the past, present, and future. It was a very intense work of research and artistic also kind of review of how the city and did approach the river and all these creeks in the last years. Well, it was very intense, and I'm not gonna go into that. I'm gonna focus on one specific part of this research, and also this is also the place of one of the creeks I walked through with this score you gave us in mind. No? So I will tell you a bit of how this interest or this work starts, and also I will talk about a particular creek which is called Butarque. Creeks are this temporary. Can you see the? I think so. No, I hope so.
It's not in full screen yet.
It's not? Okay. But it should be. Thank you very much for the control. Now it's big enough or not even? I did it before and it was good. Now it should be.
Yeah, that's better.
Thank you very much. So this Butarque Creek, for well, those that are not so familiar with Spain and Madrid, we have creeks that are these temporary rivers, no? But for many times during the year they are empty actually, no? So this work or this research started some years ago doing this work. This was a work about water in a project I did in the outside a bit of the city of Madrid. I've been working a lot with artists and in the last projects and the last years, a bit like Nick and Minty. It's a really interesting learning process. So in this work, I got to see the name of this street. You see at the back here, it says Calle, Street of Arroyo de Valdeacelada. It was the name of a creek, and I couldn't really understand why or where this name came from. You couldn't really recognize a creek or anything like that in this particular part of the city. Sometimes you know that the name of the streets they come from other places, but sometimes they are related with whatever it was there before, and this was a bit of the case, and that was a bit of this a bit of the starting point. I'm really into also like into maps and into cartography. This is a bit of like the current system of rivers and the hydrological map of the Madrid region. If you look at this later on with these are the limits of the city of Madrid. I don't know if you really recognize something like that. It's kind of strange. No, there's a dense network of blue lines almost everywhere, but in the city, like in the central part, where you can see that what happens is that the city is there. No, this was a bit of the key. You could see that where there's city, there's no rivers, there's no creeks, there are no, this dense network disappeared and was vanished. What I did is also working on like looking into all maps from late centuries ago. I could trying to trace this network of creeks and smaller rivers, and then slowly like the missing creeks would really appear and show themselves. It was really like intense work of looking and searching into many different cartographies, and then well, that was a first approach to it, and this is a bigger like the network even more detail. This was done for this exhibition I told you about. It was in Madrid Aquosa. If you wanna look into it, it's still on the website. I can later on also make write down the name of the link and so on. So when I was asked also to do this work, this score here, I was really interested in this in the southern part of Madrid, where you can see the red ones. It's kind of, I guess, obvious, but nevertheless, the red ones are the ones that are gone, like that they are not, you cannot see them any longer. But in the south, you can see that there's like an overlapping of red ones and blue ones. This means that here in the south of Madrid, in an area called Villaverde, this creek, the Butarque Creek, is still like recognized in the current maps of the city. You know, the blue line is still running, and then you would see also the red ones that are the ones that the old like the old well, the old path of these creeks. So once I had this more beautiful, super interesting cartography. Here you can see where you would find this is the upper Butarque, and then you would have a second one, which is called Mal Vecino. So I went to the area. This is a bit of trying to look for, trying to search this which is the stage of these streams. No, I started in Villaverde in the train station, looking or searching this red line. You can see here my phone where I was standing, and a little bit of how the streets and the topography would look like. No, so at the end of this, here you could see like the creek, no, back in this green tree. So a bit of the development of the walk was a bit like this, not trying to take pictures of those traces of water, and well, a bit of it's a bit self-explaining, I guess. So this is a bit of this is the one the one that is called Mal Vecino, and well, this is the stage of this creek, no. And then I got into the other point where the creek is still running, but it's underneath. It was turned or it was changed into a sewage system long ago. But then still there's these manholes where you could imagine the creek still running underneath. And then here is one of the more relevant spaces, because there here you can still like hear the sound of the creek running behind in this space, which is kind of also quite self-describing or very degraded. These are some elements. And here you can find something that is more likely like the topography, maybe the creek we had long ago. It's a short piece where you can see all these pipes, no, and how we treat these creeks and these streams. How the city design, how the city is designed, and how. This is a big infrastructure where all the water from the rain should be stored in terms of the best high, like intense or big storms. And what is also interesting, well, you can see here, no, it's still in the maps they say Arroyo Butarque, but the Arroyo isn't really there any longer. No, it's also very tricky. These things about maps, no, what is in the map is. You might think it's for real, but then it's not. And also what is interesting here is that this is the end of Madrid, and then this is another municipality, municipality of Leganés is called. And there they have the creek like open, and it's not really still, it's not the sewage. Here is when it turns into a sewage pipe. So this is a bit of a break. But nevertheless, once you pass to the other side, it's quite a bit of the same, no? This is just open, and well, the water is just not in a very healthy situation, I guess. So this is a bit of how far I reached all these elements in the stream, and a bit of this reflection also of the policy, how politics also are involved in this well, management of creeks, and that's a bit of the work I did recently, a bit of a reaction of this score you proposed, and also a bit of in terms of the discussion that is happening now. I wonder if these creeks, these Mediterranean creeks that are dry most of the year, if this non-binary kind of status, no, it's not a constant flow, that makes irrelevant to the city, that they were misunderstood, and they were neglected because they are not constantly with water. No? Perhaps there's something there to think or to develop further. So that was a bit of my small presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope we can later on talk about it more. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Malú. That was lovely to see. I was just thinking, I was trying to type it in the chat, but I wasn't quick enough. I think there's an interesting relationship between some of the work that you're talking about and Tim Sykes, who I mentioned earlier, and who is in the audience, who's looking at winterbournes in this country. So again, rivers that appear and disappear at certain times of year. Yes, I did feel very sad for that river, that creek, actually. It's wonderful that you're able to make that visible for us through your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Sage, can we pass on to you, please?
Sure, yeah. And I also just want to start with a really warm thank you to James for inviting me to be part of this, and to all the presenters for a really beautiful set of presentations. Yeah, it's been a great evening. It's really nice to be in a virtual room with a bunch of river geeks and river lovers. And yeah, also to see the Kelvin and the Clyde. I used to live by the Kelvin, so that was lovely. I was working on the understanding that I had a very tight 5 minutes to share my response to the score, but I've been invited to expand that a little bit. I know we are running a little late, so I'll just say a few words about my practice more generally. So I'm an artist geographer interested in queer and trans ecologies, rivers and wetlands. My current project is actually on COVID pandemic and thinking ecologically with the virus about everyday practices of gender. But a lot of my work has been about rivers, and in particular, as I mentioned earlier, I was initially going to go for a walk with James along the river Avon, the Bristol Avon. This is a different Avon from James's local one, and I spent a lot of time exploring the Avon when I lived in Bristol. I think, I mean, like Rachel, I was interested in the kind of the breathing space of the river, and I suppose the Bristol Avon has an exceptional tide, which and is now like heavily managed and constrained, in fact, a canalized river in most parts. But it used to be tidal as far as Bath, the next city inland, and I was really interested in kind of trying to bring the tide back to the river, or to visit the tide in the present tense in the river. A lot of my work is around temporality. I'm not going to talk about that at length, but just to pick out kind of one thread from that work, one of the things that I discovered in terms of understanding the processes through which the river was tamed and constrained and harnessed was that took place in step with the development of the triangle trade, so with slavery abroad, and particularly the harnessing of the River Avon in order to produce copper goods that were then exchanged for enslaved people in Africa to be shipped to the Caribbean to work to produce sugar and coffee, which was then brought back to Bristol, and where much of Bristol's wealth was accumulated from. So yeah, that was just one of the many threads, but that I found particularly interesting about spending time with the tide and with thinking about the fluidity of river edges and the ways that the river does help you to think about kind of race and empire and gender and all of these, the kind of entwining of these things. So I will later post a link to a blog page where you can see more kind of drawings from that time. But I want to just, I think, take the time to share, hopefully. Yeah, okay. My response to the Queer River score, Cold Feet. I was actually in a talk this morning by Rosie Brodati, who's done a lot of work on, I guess, kind of post-human knowledge and post-human thought around subjectivity. And one of the things that Brodati argues is that recognizing the permeability of individual lives calls for an enlarged, distributed, and transversal concept of what a subject is and of how it deploys its relational capacities. So a transversal in mathematical terminology is a line that crosses another system of lines, and in so doing helps to reveal something about the nature of the relationships between those lines. So in the context of philosophy and perhaps of practice, transversality is a concept that pushes us to think across established systems of demarcation, of categorization and organization, and thinking how can we move horizontally or laterally across those established boundaries to think subjectivity in a more collective fashion. So a lot of my work tries to do exactly that. I use drawing in my research as a way of trying to think sideways. And the score which Queer River provides was a really beautiful invitation to spend some time doing that. So this is the drawing that I produced a couple of days ago when I was sitting by the DNS River, which runs through the valley where I've recently relocated to in County Durham. And I'm just going to read to you a brief text that I wrote while sitting there. That's my kind of response to the score, I suppose. The spot where I sit is an island of sorts amid the bifurcating winter channels of the DNS River. The low sun glints on river pebbles, fallen leaves, ripples, twigs, and branches. The distinction between land and water is extremely difficult to draw. Moments of stillness and prolific movement spill across the lines of the water's edge. I'm new to this valley. The river is slowly becoming familiar, but I don't yet know it well. It seems a wistful, a hopeful place. The mines dominated here for a time and now are gone, leaving the valley rich and little but spoil. The river in summer when we arrived was clotted with balsam and choked with hogweed. It runs clearer now in the cool of autumn, but I've wondered what makes its community what it is. Is it polluted with agricultural runoff? Is it nutrient overload that gives the river its air of diminishment and neglect? Or is it poisoned with mineral detritus from the mines? I called the river unloved one time when speaking to a local organizer, and he set me straight. This place is well loved, but perhaps could benefit from new and different kinds of care. Perhaps this is something I could offer. What would the river need to nurse it back to health? What kinds of relationships might it want? As a newcomer, I have more questions than answers. Apologies, this isn't playing. Okay. I came down to the river earlier, before breakfast, to the spot where a ford crosses the water. The water tugged at me in the dawn half-light. I hesitated, started to head up the hill to warmth and breakfast, then turned back again. I took off my boots and stepped barefoot into the shallow riffles, my feet ambivalent about the sensations, alive, exhilarated, recoiling slightly at the sharp cold of the rocks underfoot. It's tempting to think of queer as an openness, a defiant refutation of boundaries and constraints, an embrace of nature's transgression and excess. But queerness can also be a defensive attitude. We resist boundaries and classifications because of the ways they are used to harm and exclude us. In the process, we lose out on the comforts of experiencing a good fit, of fitting in. Sometimes we make of transgression a new set of queer norms, judging those already most judged for the ways they find of getting by. Queerness has to do with an orientation, the way we arrive in a space ready to take nothing for granted, to make no assumptions, but it also has to do with how we are received. 4 months after arriving here, 6 months after making first inquiries, I haven't yet found a GP who is willing to take on my routine prescriptions, medicine that allows me to maintain some sense of congruity in my everyday life. The DNS where we live is within the catchment of the River Wear that flows through Durham, but it lies outside the catchment of the only trans-friendly GP in the area. A colleague has kindly lent me her address so that I can register as a visitor, bending boundaries to get a provisional foot in the door. Even then, though, they won't continue my care without advice from a specialist clinic, an appointment for which I've been waiting now for 5 years, 3 months, and 24 days. There is something tentative yet persistent about this little river in its gutted valley, and the young woods that have sprung up along its edges in the footprints of the mines. Yet the winter sun is unequivocal. It ignites the bare branches, the leaves like plates and flecks of gold. Fungi proliferate here, and there are small birds calling, flitting busily among the branches. Human traffic buzzes on the bridge behind me. Here is life. I put down my pencil and reach to pull off my boots. Thank you. That's me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sage. I really enjoyed that. I'm finding it difficult whizzing on from one person to the next thing, because I feel like I've got so much to say to all of you, but I'm deliberately biting my tongue so we save room for people to ask you all questions at the end. But thank you to everyone that's given a presentation today. I feel like I've got huge amounts to think about and process from now onwards, and I'm sure lots of other people can or have as well. Kazi, can we invite you back in to start off our question and answer or discussion?
Absolutely. And can I just say, I'm really, really glad to count myself now amongst the river geeks. I feel one of you. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. There's a question or an observation that came up from Nicholas in the chat around a word I have to say that was new to me, riparian. I suppose this is probably very familiar to you. Spaces along riverbanks, and that sort of the unknowability of those spaces, which he identifies as a common thread between these presentations. And I wondered if any of you might want to expand on that, and particularly that liminal space between water and land. Why is that such an evocative starting place for your work? Oh, I see Sage. Is that muting or unmuting, Sage?
Well, I've just been speaking, so I thought I'd give someone a chance.
Or maybe then first, if I turn to Minty for that one.
Oh, okay. Well, the Nicholas who's posted the question is Nick Miller, who's my collaborator. So who's in the room next door. Slightly odd responding to the I guess I was thinking it's really super fascinating, interesting conversations, and I'd love to have had longer. But I guess one of the things that really struck me is that, we were talking about rivers in spatial terms, and I think often certainly in Scotland, we don't really think about seasonal rivers in the same way, even though the rivers maybe get larger and smaller, they're kind of always there. But in other places, the winter burns and the creeks that Malú's been talking about, that kind of riparian land is more temporal. It's as much to do with time as space in a way. But I just think that there is something that kind of this weird idea that we have of rivers as kind of blue lines on a map is when you start thinking about the kind of queering of rivers. It's super fascinating. The two, I didn't talk about the kind of piece I made that showed the sort of intercutting between the Clyde and the Manzanares in Madrid, which all have this really hard boundary between the river and the land. But in Madrid, the authorities have chosen to drop the river level. Malú can correct me if I'm getting the technicalities wrong here, and it means that islands have grown in the river. So the river now is this kind of amazingly biodiverse site with islands and trees, and that kind of water is queered in a way that absolutely doesn't happen in the Clyde. The rivers are very different, but it's kind of interesting that within the sharply defined it's kind of riparian space, there is still this kind of blurring of water and land. So yeah, I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Minty. Is there anyone else? Does anyone want to come in on that? Yes, James.
Yeah, it's not necessarily answering the question, but it's more responding to that and the relationship between what is seen and unseen and what is valued and not valued, really. Again, not having an answer necessarily, but I was interested in how that relates to the sense of care that Sage mentioned, but also in Rachel's presentation, how she was talking about this need to flow. And I'm very interested in that interrelationship of the individual sense of well-being and ecological well-being as well, and the fact that the two are essentially indivisible and we can learn so much from each other. But also in terms of that hard edge, that hard line, I'm very interested in beavers, and I'm looking a lot at beavers at the moment and what they can do for us in terms of blurring those boundaries between the water and the land. And obviously that's a very key thing in Scotland at the moment in terms of looking at changing the laws, basically, so beavers can be moved between catchments rather than being killed, basically. So just throwing that in there.
Thanks, James. I don't think it was a question to be answered. I think it was you throwing ideas out there. And as Dee says, we love the beavers, so let's keep them going. Dee also has a really fascinating question that I'd really love all of your takes on. How do you get to know a river? Maybe a deceptively simple question. I don't know if one of you wants to take that one on. Yes, go for it, Sage.
I'm going to try and answer, or not answer, but respond to both of those complications together. But I think sharing a lot, like Malú and Rachel both kind of touched on these things as well, but something about rivers' refusal to be constrained or to be kept to the constraints that people have tried to impose upon them over time speaks. Like the river actually grabs our attention. It insists on, or at least it invites some of us to get to know, to get to know the river. And I think for me, with the Avon, the Bristol Avon, I started exploring that question: how do I get to know the river? Because I was doing an evening art class once a fortnight. So I was cycling along the River Avon, which is contained in a new cut. So it's actually kind of a man-made dug ditch that this huge tidal river flows through. And it just so happened that my cycle ride coincided with the full and the empty tide on alternate fortnights. So each time I cycled, it was either like brim full river that looked like it was really kind of bursting to take over the whole city, and then just being like a trickle in the bottom of this muddy edge. And so it just kind of impressed itself on me that this doesn't make sense. Like if the river has that much movement in it, it doesn't make sense that it's so contained. And it was from there that I slowly started to kind of to read, to research, to understand how that river would once have interacted with its landscape, like so vastly, so kind of transformatively. And that's just kind of, that's invisible now, that's lost to us. But I would say, I mean, I don't know how do you get to know the river. What I then did was spend a lot of time on the river and quite a lot of time in libraries. But it was a kind of the river that insisted on that relationship to begin with. And I think maybe that's where you start, is with the invitation.
For me, I would like to add something about how you can get to learn or know these places that are gone, for instance, in this particular case of Madrid. For the exhibition, we did a lot of interviews with people of a certain age, like even like 90s, 80s, 90 years old, and then they would describe the landscape, these creeks, and what they did there, and it was amazing. It was a really beautiful way to get to imagine these places or get more in contact with that. Even when they would describe it, they were polluted in some time. This is for this particular case in Madrid, they're completely gone. There's still this memory, and in that sense, they are still like being, like they still exist in terms of they are still in the memories of these people. And we did record all of these interviews, and we could hear them in the exhibition. So it's also a bit of archive for future generations, a bit of trying to remind what was this kind of urban areas.
Thank you, Malú. Rachel, is there anything?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just wondering, Rachel, if you had anything to bring in on that question of how do you get to know a river?
Oh, I do, and I'll keep it brief because I'm such a waffler. But I think the main point I want to bring up there, because I think, like Sage, I think, and Malú, I think the main thing is spending time and talking to people who know the river, who live with the river as well. I think those two things are kind of key. But I think as well as something that I discovered through my own research was that not everybody has access to the river, and not everybody has equal access to the river. And whether that's because of physical restraints or you know, the river not being accessible in urban contexts, or whether it's because the river's walled away and you can't get to the river because it's just inaccessible because of the built infrastructure, or whether it's because people need support to get to the river but don't have support, don't have access to support. Whatever the reason is, the access to a river isn't equal. And so the question is kind of, it's a brilliant question, but it's also one that kind of, if we unpack it, it shows some of the inequalities around engaging with rivers as well. So I just wanted to bring that in. But I think, yeah, the two things about spending time with the river, responding to the invitations that the rivers give, absolutely. And I also think what James said, there is a voice to the river, and the more time you spend with the river, you begin to hear the voice of the river as well. And that's something also that some of my collaborators have talked about as well. Yeah.
Thank you. James, you were coming in there.
Yeah, I mean, it connects very much with what Rachel was saying. I mean, I think a lot of what I've learned through Queer River is that it's very much about unlearning what I thought I knew about rivers, really. So, for instance, striding out to find the source of my local river and basically realizing there isn't one, because, you know, these things aren't singular, because the water comes from everywhere and there is no dividing line between the land and the water. So where I am, for instance, it's a chalk stream, and the rainwater is filtered down through the downs and eventually arrives at the river. And from walking with Tim Sykes, he made me aware of the aquifers and how much water is actually below the ground. And so the importance to me of not knowing, of being open to having your preconceptions challenged by walking with the river and learning from the river. And I think that comes back to what Rachel was just saying about your orientation. I had a good friend of mine called Kathy Skerritt, who sadly is no longer with us, but was based in the States. And I did some collaborative work with her. And she just used to suggest that we go out one day and we talk to the river in certain ways, like saying, the river is me, I am the river, and thinking about how does that change our orientation. And I just thought that links in nicely with the comment has gone off the top of my chat, but it was around spirituality. And for me, that links in with spirituality and spiritual practice in terms of, if you like, knowing oneness through being open to being taught by being with and walking with a river. Don't know how much that makes sense to everybody else, but essentially that is what I'm gaining through this work.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, the question was from Joan around, I'm curious if any of the presenters have engaged with earth-based spirituality in their practice with rivers. Thanks for picking that up, James. I'm conscious that we're running out of time, I'm afraid. And I don't know if there's anything that the panelists would want to say to round things off before I hand back to you, James, to close the session. No, resolutely muted. I'll hand back over to you, then, James, to round things off.
Thank you. I mean, I just wanted to thank everybody because, first of all, Kazi and the university for inviting me to come up to Glasgow, and then all the collaborators that have been part of this. It's been, when people ask me what Queer River is, it's quite hard to explain because essentially it's about relationship and it's about dialogue, and that is so fluid, which is apt as we're working with rivers. So thank you for everybody for coming and contributing today.